think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
On this episode, I'm going to talk about some of the more strange things of note that have happened to me and other people close to me throughout my life. This will be the second to last episode like this, as up to this point, I've basically been laying the foundation for this podcast by recounting aspects of my past so that the listener can get to know me a little more. That's something that I've loved about podcasts that I listen to, getting to know the hosts in a personal way. I see podcasts being, in a way, what reality TV has pretended to be. So I wanted to bring at least a little bit of that personalization to the podcast, in addition to a touch of a sense of humor. Alright, I have some various unrelated stories from my past to share here. To distinguish them, I'll give them titles. In this episode, I'll be doing The Divided Neonate, Bedpole, and Jonathan. Also, there will be a news source for some of the news stories I'm going to be reading from now on. That would be cryptozoologynews.com. Unfortunately, they don't date the news articles, so I won't be able to provide, a date for those bits of news. Alright, and on to the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
August 13th, 1947, 1300 hours. Twin Falls, Smoke River Canyon, Idaho. Two boys and their father saw a sky blue object 100 meters away and 25 meters above ground. Treetops under it were spinning wildly, although the object itself did not spin. It made a swishing sound. Shape, inverted plate, 7 meters diameter and 3.5 meters thick. There was a red flame on one side of the top. August 14th, 1947, 0900 hours. Revejo, Italy. R.L. Johannes saw a disc on the ground and two dwarfs less than 1 meter tall, wearing dark blue coveralls with red collars and belts. They had oversized heads, greenish faces, huge, salient dark eyes without eyelashes or eyebrows, but surrounded by a ring-like muscle. They wore something similar to crash helmets. The center of their belts produced a quote-unquote vapor, and the witness suffocated, feeling a strong electrical discharge. The creatures had greenish hands with 8 talon-like fingers. In 1948, in Swastika, Canada, that's an unfortunately named place, Mr. Galbraith twice saw an object land. The first time, it was a disc-shaped craft with a humanoid figure. The second time, cigar-shaped with 3 figures. July 29th, 1948, Indianapolis, Indiana. An object swept over the road at 10-meter altitude. August 11th, 1948, 1200 hours. Hamel, Minnesota. Two boys were playing outside when a round, dull gray object, 70 centimeters in diameter, 30 centimeters thick, landed near them like a balloon with a metallic noise. It spun, went up, hovered, maneuvered to avoid telephone lines and trees, and flew away to the northeast. An FBI man from St. Paul found an area 70 centimeters in diameter where the ground showed signs of extreme pressure. August 29th, 1948, 0503 hours, Maplewood, Ohio. A farmer observed a silvery sphere of large dimension rise from a wooded area and hover above his farm, dropping a silvery substance that disintegrated before touching the ground. February 1949, 1630 hours, Pucusana, Peru. CAV, an oil company employee, 30 years old, was driving to Lima when he saw a shiny disc at ground level. He walked toward it for 10 minutes. 3 figures came out as he was 20 meters away. They looked like mummies, had joined legs and 1 large foot. They slid along the ground. They were covered with a strange towel-y skin, asked the witness where they were, had a lengthy discussion with him, and took him for a trip in their craft. On February 17th, 1949, in France, exact location unknown, Alain Berard saw a large bright object land near his farm with a green lightning flash. It became dark. As he approached the craft, the witness saw 3 figures with stocky short legs, apparently without heads. Frightened, he fired at them 3 times. A moment later, the object took off vertically. August 19th, 1949, Death Valley, California. 2 prospectors are said to have observed a disc-shaped object land. 2 dwarfs emerged, but were lost in the sand dunes when pursued. The object disappeared. Fall 1949, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Don Bushnell, plant superintendent with Southwestern Porcelain Steel Corporation, saw an object fall in front of his car as his radio was blocked. He applied the brakes, the object vanished. January 29, 1950, South Table Mountain, Colorado. Mr. Quintana of Denver saw a silvery green of ovoid object hovering about 15 meters above a slope and landing slowly in a small ravine. Then it shot upward at very high speed. Its diameter was about 20 meters, and it had a revolving middle band. A greenish light flashed under it, and the witness felt a rush of air and a pungent smell. Now some strange events from Alberta, Canada. Banff National Park. Midges encased in ice fell from the sky, 16th February 1952. Bigfoot was seen in the park in August 1968. Other locations in Alberta of pre-1981 Bigfoot sightings include North Saskatchewan Valley, March and July 1969, Bighorn Dam, North Saskatchewan River, August 1969, near Rocky Mountain House, summer 1972, near Seven Persons, autumn 1972, October and December 1983, near Bighorn Dam, May 1974, near Sexsmith, October 1975, near Cold Lake, summer 1976, near Caroline, September 1976, near Rochester, October 1976, Battle River, Clearwater River, North and South Saskatchewan Rivers, water monster reports. Bonus Lagoon, Cold Lake, Heart Lake, Lake McGregor, Lake Minnewaca, lake monster reports. Christina Lake, reports of lake monster 30 to 40 feet long with 3-foot hairy neck, horse-like head, and big eyes, June 1984. Saddle Lake, 100 sightings of lake monster during 1974 to 1984, 75 to 150 feet long with horse-like head. Now from British Columbia, lake monster reports in Bennett Lake, Chadburn Lake, Lake Cowichan, Lake Harrison, Lake Kamloops, Lake Cathlin, Lake Kootenay, Martins Lake, Lake Osoyoos, Satan Lake, Lake Shaka, Lake Somenos, Lake Tagai, Williams Lake. In the Campbell River area, site of possible first Bigfoot sighting in British Columbia this century in 1901. Timber cruiser Mike King was watching Bigfoot washing roots in water and placing them in neat piles. Many other sightings in British Columbia up to 1980, for example at Cougar Lake, 1915, where prospectors watched Bigfoot eating berries. The case of Albert Osman, kidnapped by Bigfoot in summer 1924, Morris Creek, July 1936, where Bigfoot threw rocks at an Indian in a canoe. Micah Mountain, where William Rowe had a close view of a Bigfoot eating leaves, October 1955. Bella Coola, where female Bigfoot and 2 youngsters seen, April 1962. Roscoe Inlet, July 1973, where a fisheries patrolman watched Bigfoot on beach. In Chilliwack, poltergeist outbreak characterized by loud rappings in the walls, several months from October 1951. Duncan, burning mass fell from sky, landing on asphalt road. Samples of rock-like substance taken for analysis, 11th March 1984. Near Fellers Heights, 4 members of oil crew saw Bigfoot in remote forest clearing, 14th March 1987. North Vancouver, poltergeist centered on 3-year-old boy who had a ghostly friend, 1977. Lake Okanagan, home of lake monster Ogopogo. Between Prince Rupert and Kamloops, 2 big feet seen at night crouching under tree, third standing upright nearby. It appeared 11 to 12 feet tall and weighing 800 to 1,000 pounds, 24th December 1983. Saanich, Vancouver Island. Teenage boys reported seeing 8-foot hairy creature in the bush, February 1982. Lake Shuswap, lake monster reports. Griffith's family saw 7 dark grayish humps while out sailing, around 20 to 25 feet long and moving quite fast, June 1984. South Burnaby. Slime smelling like dung fell from sky onto elementary school for 3 days. February 1986. Terrace. Schoolboy saw, quote, little green man, who spoke in an incomprehensible tongue and gave boy a lump of strange substance before disappearing. It gradually shrank and disappeared, or was lost. Late February 1970. Thetis Lake. Monster seen with human-like body, silver and scaly, big ears, razor-sharp points on head, 19 and 23rd August 1972. Thompson River, Kamloops. Fishermen saw UFO emerge from river and fly away, raining down pellets, 16th May 1981. Vancouver Island. Hannah McRoberts photographed UFO, October 1981. Many sightings of Cadborosaurus, or Caddy, British Columbia's sea monster, have been made around Vancouver Island. Favored locations include Macaulay Point, Chemainus Bay, Stewart Channel, Pender Island, Valdez Island, Queen Charlotte Islands, and Cadboro Bay. In June 1889, Mrs. F.C. McAlpine went to meet her sister off the train in Castle Blaney, and, when she failed to arrive, decided to go for a walk by the lake. Quote, being at length tired, I sat down to rest upon a rock at the edge of the water. My attention was quite taken up with the extreme beauty of the scene before me. There was not a sound of movement except the soft ripple of the water on the sand at my feet. Presently, I felt a cold chill creep through me and a curious stiffness in my limbs. as if I could not move, though wishing to do so. I felt frightened, yet chained to the spot, as if impelled to stare at the water straight in front of me. Gradually, a black cloud seemed to rise, and in the midst of it, I saw a tall man in a suit of tweed jump into the water and sink. In a moment the darkness was gone, and I again became sensible of the heat and the sunshine, but I was awed and felt eerie. On my sister's arrival, I told her of the occurrence. She was surprised but inclined to laugh at it. When we got home, I told my brother. He treated the subject in much the same manner. However, about a week afterwards, Mr. Espy, a bank clerk unknown to me, committed suicide by drowning at that very spot. He left a letter for his wife, indicating that for some time he had contemplated his death." End quote. On the night of July 31st, 1966, a glowing object chose to land on a deserted beach in Presque Island Park, Erie, Pennsylvania, while 5 young people in a car stuck in the sand a few hundred feet away watched. After it landed, the object projected a strange beam of light into a nearby woods. Then a tall, dark figure shuffled up to the car and terrified the witnesses, leaving a scratch on the roof of the vehicle. The next day, quantities of silicon were found at the landing site, along with some peculiar cone-like indentations in the sand. The Presque Isle police vouched for the witnesses and said that they were sincerely frightened. Scores of other people in Erie reported seeing unusual aerial lights that night. There's another story, it's also from Erie, Pennsylvania. Mrs. Julie Hellwig says she was awakened by barking dogs at 5:30 a.m. on the morning of Wednesday, August 3, 1966, and when she looked out the window, she saw a human-shaped being about 5 feet 6 inches tall. It was clothed, she said, in a yellow jacket and yellow trousers, with no discernible pockets, belts, or other features. The head, she said, was huge, moon-shaped, and when seen from the side, the back appeared to be flat. This head was covered with straggly brown hair, a muddy color. The creature had very big shoulders and a slender build, and moved with a stiff, jerky mechanical motion, holding its arms close to its sides. The arms did not move at all. Its legs did not bend at the knees. "He moved," she said, "like a mechanical wind-up toy." Local dogs were barking at its heels, but it ignored them. The sight of this creature frightened her, and she woke up her husband. He looked out the window, but since he was not wearing his glasses, he said he only saw something moving. The creature appeared across from the United Oil storage tanks on West 3rd Street and walked stiffly out of view. Another woman in the area saw a similar creature that same week. This woman, who wants to remain anonymous, said she was driving down 3rd Street late at night when she saw the creature. She stopped her car, it came up to the car, pounded on the hood, then moved off into the darkness. A Catholic family living in Lee, Massachusetts, USA, were attacked in 1981 by a, quote, demonic spirit, which decapitated religious statues, threw a crucifix downstairs, and stuck a butcher's knife in a kitchen table. The Molignon, Switzerland poltergeist of 1914 was also anti-Catholic. An 11-year-old boy suffered convulsions, and poltergeist-type phenomena occurred in his presence. The family tried to overcome it by the power of religion, which spurred the poltergeist to even greater efforts. As a Capuchin friar was pouring holy water into a stoup, the vessel was broken with a stone, and a blessed metal fastened around the boy's neck unfastened itself and was thrown into the air. The arrival of 4 more priests reading prayers and invocations failed to dispel the poltergeist, which continued to pelt the boy with stones. In the case of the Ninamangalam, India poltergeist, the afflicted family of the sub-magistrate was Catholic and attempted to fend off the poltergeist using crucifixes and religious pictures. But the pictures were thrown down and broken, and the crucifixes burned or thrown away. Some of the poltergeist's written messages have already been given, but another read in part, "The inmates of this house have done nothing against me. I will not leave them alone unless they become Hindus." The sub-magistrate replied, "O devil, you think it easy to convert me to Hinduism by your threatening writings. Beware, I am the child of God. I give you to understand clearly this moment, once for all, that I am ready to lose my property, wife, children, and all that I possess, and my life too. But don't think I will ever lose my soul. I am ready to die a martyr for the sake of my Savior, Lord Jesus Christ." This exchange suggests that there was some hidden conflict either in the household or in certain members of it concerning whether they should have been following the traditional Hindu religious practices rather than the adopted Catholicism. The Houston Post of April 22, 1897, reports, Rockland, Mr. John M. Barkley, living near this place, reports that last night about 11 o'clock, after having retired, he heard his dog barking furiously, together with a whining noise. He went to the door to ascertain the trouble and saw something, he says, that made his eyes bulge out, and but for the fact that he had been reading of an airship that was supposed to have been in over Texas, he would have taken to the woods. It was a peculiar shaped body, with an oblong shape, with wings and side attachments of various sizes and shapes. There were brilliant lights, which appeared much brighter than electrical lights. When he first saw it, it seemed perfectly stationary about 5 yards from the ground. It circled a few times and gradually descended to the ground in a pasture adjacent to his house. He took his Winchester and went down to investigate. As soon as the ship, or whatever it might be, alighted, the lights went out. The night was bright enough for a man to be distinguished several yards, and when within about 30 yards of the ship, he was met by an ordinary mortal, who requested him to lay his gun aside as no harm was intended. Whereupon the following conversation ensued. Mr. Barclay inquired, "Who are you and what do you want?" "Never mind about my name, call it Smith. I want some lubricating oil and a couple of cold chisels if you can get them, and some bluestone. I suppose the sawmill hard by has the two former articles, and the telegraph operator has the bluestone. Here's a $10 bill. Take it and get us these articles and keep the change for your trouble." Mr. Barclay said, "What have you got down there? Let me go and see it." He who wanted to be called Smith said, "No, we cannot permit you to approach any nearer. But do as we request, you and your kindness will be appreciated, and we will call you some future day and reciprocate your kindness by taking you on a trip." Mr. Barclay went and procured the oil and cold chisels, but could not get the bluestone. They had no change, and Mr. Barclay tendered him the $10 bill, but the same was refused. The man shook hands with him and thanked him cordially and asked that he not follow him to the vessel. As he left, Mr. Barclay called him and asked him where he was from and where he was going. He replied, "From anywhere. But we will be in Greece day after tomorrow." He got on board when there was again the whirring noise, and the thing was gone, as Mr. Barclay expresses it, like a shot out of a gun. Mr. Barclay is perfectly reliable. On January 7th, 1970, in Imjärvi, Mikkeli, Finland, Eskil Virjo, a 38-year-old farmer, and Arno Heinonen, a 36-year-old forester, had been skiing. At 4:45 in the afternoon, they paused in a glade when they heard a buzzing sound and saw a bright light in the sky. Suddenly, the light was enveloped in a reddish-gray mist or cloud, the top of which emitted puffs of smoke. As the cloud descended, the witnesses noticed that inside was a round metallic object about 9 feet in diameter. On its bottom were 3 hemispheres and a central tube. When the buzzing increased, the cloud disappeared, and the object descended to about 10 feet above the ground. A light beam then emerged from the central tube, illuminating a 3-foot circle in the snow below. Heinonen felt as if someone was grabbing his waist and pulling him backward, so he stepped back a step and saw a creature appear in the light beam. The creature was about 3 feet tall and had narrow slanting shoulders and thin arms and legs. It had a pale waxy face, small eyes, a curious hook nose, and small ears that narrowed toward the head. The creature wore light green overalls, darker green boots that stretched above the knees, and white gloves that reached above the elbows. Its claw-like fingers held a black box with a round opening that emitted a bright, pulsing yellow light. On its head was a shiny conical helmet. As the creature pointed the box's opening toward Heinonen, a thick reddish-gray mist descended from the object. Large sparks, 4 inches long and colored red, green, and purple, emerged from the illuminated circle above the snow. The witnesses felt nothing when the sparks hit them. Soon the mist became so thick that the two witnesses could no longer see each other or the creature just standing 9 feet away. Finally, the light beam seemed to retract back into the tube, the mist broke, and the air above them cleared. Heinonen felt that his right side had become numb, and when he tried to take a step forward on his skis, he fell. He abandoned his skis and, with Viljo's help, returned to the cottage belonging to Heinonen's parents. There he felt increasingly ill, had a headache, difficulty breathing, body pains, vomiting, loss of memory, and urine as black as coffee. He continued to feel ill for months. Viljo had also been physically affected. His face became swollen and red an hour after the encounter, and he later had difficulty with his balance, suffered a headache, and felt pain in his eyes. The doctor who examined both men believed that they had suffered a great shock. Their symptoms resembled those of radiation exposure. A reporter later located 2 independent witnesses who had seen a strange light in the sky later that day. Heinonen went on to have many more UFO experiences in the years that followed, and eventually became a contactee. In Sacramento, California, a minister claims she and her daughter saw an unidentified flying creature that looked like it was, quote, straight out of Jurassic Park. The minister, a 50-year-old Texas resident and avid birdwatcher, said they were at Stone Lakes National Wildlife Refuge south of Sacramento when the creature showed up on a clear spring day. Quote, "We were hiking and looking for blue herons and other migratory birds," the woman told Cryptozoology News on Thursday. "My daughter and I saw the bird first, and we both pointed to it, stunned and in shock, as we tried to come up with a logical explanation for what we thought we were seeing. It was not a kite, it was a real animal," she added about the alleged 1994 encounter. The eyewitness says they observed the animal for about 20 minutes as it circled an area and then veered off in a different direction. She explains that even though it makes her, quote, nervous to have to admit it, the bird was very pterodactyl in shape. Quote, "That is the only point of reference I have for it. I remember I said, that's impossible, they are an extinct species. My daughter, who was well read on extinct birds, kept pointing out the unusual features of this animal." She says her daughter described the creature as having a featherless, long, thin tail and a pterodactyl-like head. Its wings, she explained, were not shaped like a bird's wings. It had a long neck, long head, and long pointed beak area. It had a large wingspan, bigger than a blue heron. It was gliding very high up, with very little flapping movements of its wings. The minister admits to being a little freaked out at the time and wondered whether the creature would attack them. I couldn't wait to get back to the car. When we got back, we couldn't stop talking about it. The two family members say that even though to this day they cannot possibly identify the bird as a dinosaur, they know what it resembled. Quote, while on the phone with my daughter tonight, we both Googled photos of pterodactyl sightings, and some of them are similar to what we saw, she confessed. Being birders, we were familiar with most birds. I didn't think I could call Audubon Society and tell them about the sighting because this bird was not on their checklist. They would have likely told me that I misidentified it because it was up in the air and that it was probably a crane or heron, believing that would certainly solve things, but my brain wouldn't rest. What we saw was neither a crane nor a heron. We saw a real living animal that was not familiar to us and looked like it was straight out of Jurassic Park. In the sighting, she explains, also carried social problems and the risk of ostracization, so they have kept it pretty much a secret until today. Quote, I did tell a couple of people. I told them factually, and they just stared at me saying, wow. I do not want to be exposed to the ridicule and have to defend my story, which I finally got brave enough to share. My daughter and I talk about it sometimes, discussing it like it's self-counseling. It gives us an opportunity to share that experience again and validate each other. At least we know what we saw, and discussing it is one way to try to keep the story alive, unravel the mystery in our heads, and find some kind of understanding and clarity as time passes. It does help to read online that others are seeing these animals also. This is what gave me the idea to come forward and share our sightings, said the minister. Reports of unidentified birds have been numerous this year. Just like last week, 2 people in Nevada reported seeing a creature that reminded them of a pterosaur, a flying reptile believed to have gone extinct about 65 million years ago. In 1890, Arizona newspaper The Tombstone Epitaph wrote about 2 ranchers killing a winged monster similar to an alligator in the desert between the Whetstone and Huachaka Mountains. The Stone Lakes National Wildlife Refuge is located on the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta and serves as a protective habitat to thousands of migratory birds. In Canada, an Oshawa resident on Wednesday released 2 images of an unidentified flying object exhibiting biological features. Ken Rice said he was taking pictures of nature when he noticed the anomaly in the sky on June 17th. Quote, it was 7:45 p.m. and this thing came out of nowhere, said the wildlife photographer. It sat there, hovered for a minute or so, and then it flew away. Rice, who initially believed the flying object to be a turkey vulture, said he realized he was looking at something else once he arrived home and took a good look at the pictures. The 2 images, exceedingly zoomed in to see more detail, show a green insect-like creature allegedly floating in the middle of the Oshawa sky near Colonel Sam Drive. The photographs suggest the UFO was bigger than any insect known today. Rice believes it couldn't have been a balloon because it disappeared very fast and definitely not a kite. Also, the Southern Ontario man added, he looked for pictures of, quote, the weather balloon online and wasn't able to find anything like it. Rice posted the pictures on Facebook to see if somebody could solve the mystery. In 2003, another Canadian claimed to have seen a flying snake-like creature in the woods of Prince Edward County. In Brownsville, Texas, a man says he was startled when a reptilian creature allegedly entered his grandmother's home located in the southernmost tip of Texas. The man submitted the report, a 23-year-old Brownsville student who provided his full name but requested to remain anonymous, told Cryptozoology News that he was in the living room having dinner when the creature partially showed up. I was watching TV while eating a bowl of noodles, he said about the 2003 encounter. He was 11 years old at the time of the incident. No one was home because everyone but me went to church that night, he added. He maintains that as he sat there, he kept feeling this presence inside the house. Quote, I had the kitchen light turned on in the hallway, along with the rest of the home was dark. The darkest area was the hallway. Suddenly, he says he saw a hand wrapping its fingers around the corner. I saw it and closed my eyes and shook my head, only to see its hand still holding onto that corner. He describes the purported creature as being reptilian in nature, of a blackish color and covered in scales. The fingertip nails looked almost like the ones from the alien from the movie Signs, when Mel Gibson goes to look at the bottom of the door to see what was on the other side, only to see something try to scratch him like that, but also darkish black, said the Texan. The student, who claims the hand remained there for about 5 minutes, says he felt so much fear that he chose to get out of the residence. I waited for my family to come home to tell them what I witnessed, he said. My family kind of mocked me and told me it was a demon messing with me for not going to church. I haven't seen it since, but the vibe I get when I'm at my grandmother's alone is still there. I do believe it was some type of reptilian. I didn't have any friends in that neighborhood, so it wasn't a prank. No one was in that home but that thing and me. In 2002, a girl in Virginia claimed to have seen a similar creature while camping at the Yogi Bear's Jellystone Park in Page County. She stated that the animal looked like, quote, the mix of a horse and a Komodo dragon with a dark gray-brown color. Last April, a motorist in Florida took a photograph of what he called a being with heavy eyelids and weird scaly protrusions driving a vehicle in front of him. Back in February, a woman told Cryptozoology News that her Native American grandparents had encountered an unidentified reptile-like creature while crossing the Sabine River from Louisiana to Texas in 1920. Last month, a New Jersey woman claimed that a quote-unquote reptilian humanoid had entered her house and taken her watch with a circular energy tool.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out of you.
The divided neonate. This bizarre and mortifying occurrence happened to me when I was rather young. Universal Studios Orlando had just opened and my family decided to start the day with a visit to a show which, at the time, was called the Phantom of the Opera Horror Makeup Show. A rather deceptive title given how shocking and gory the show actually turned out being. Years later, surely due to the complaints of parents with traumatized children, they changed the name to the Gory, Gruesome, and Gross Horror Makeup Show. Up to that point in my life, my parents had sheltered me from violent and gory material in movies and TV, and not an easy task given that it was the 1980s. At one point in the show, there was a montage of many gory and violent scenes from various Universal Studios movies. It was a veritable phantasmagoria of death and mutilation, and it was quite a system shock for me at the time. Then, one of the hosts brought out a latex dummy of the mutilated torso of a woman and shook it around over the audience, saying something along the lines of, "This is Jessica! Say hello to Jessica, everyone!" I left that show in a state of shock. I remember sitting there during lunch at Lombard's Landing, just staring forward, all the horrible things I had just seen running through my head over and over again. Later on that day, we were waiting in a very long line outside of the Nickelodeon Studios tour, and something very strange happened to me. Maybe it was the fact that the long, silent wait put me into some sort of trance or meditative state, and this, combined with the state of shock I was in, caused this strange event to occur. I don't know. But I was suddenly assaulted with very strong impressions, feelings, and imagery. Now, a lot of the experience was completely beyond verbal description, but some aspects of it were visual in a way. I'll do the best I can to convey the feelings and impressions I experienced. There was a deep foundation of atrocity, like abomination, a sense that a horribly powerful desecration had taken place, or was taking place. It felt like witnessing a child being killed in an amusement park accident or something like that. You know, just, very strong essence of something pure and completely innocent and precious being obliterated, like utterly defiled. Complete desecration of innocence. Very, very strong feeling. There was also the sense of a presence, of an intensely uncompassionate presence or intention. It was very alien and very, very uncaring. I've never felt such an utterly complete, cold, inhuman lack of sympathy. Well, that's kind of the best I can do to convey the feeling of the event. Now, there were also visual images that flashed through my head somehow. There was an environment which was extremely clinical and medical. This place was the abode of the presence. I felt that somehow. In this hospital-like place, there was a display case. And I remember just suspended inside this display case, there was a very young little girl, about 3 years old, wearing a little dress. But the thing is, her body had been divided horizontally in multiple places, and those slices were separated from each other a little bit, so you could see her insides. It's like that horse in that movie, The Cell. Anyway, her dress was also cleanly divided and arranged neatly over each corresponding slice of her body. Oh, I might add, this happened to me before I ever saw the movie Cell, before it ever came out. This image and the accompanying feelings unsettled me deeply, much more than anything at the horror makeup show. The thing that really overwhelmed me was just the assurance of a presence of an outsider. The thing which had divided that innocent little girl. It seemed like intent on synthesizing the nature of abomination, or basically bringing on defilement of innocence, bringing it into the laboratory and the technical and scientific scrutiny somehow, for some reason. Now, something else which was an inherent part of this experience was an assurance that the presence was not merely a result of my shock, that it wasn't just imagined. I was certain that it was very real and very active. I was horribly upset by this for quite a while, needless to say. And honestly, to this day, Universal Studios Orlando gives me a bit of a chill. Now, something else. Well, my spirit guide tells me now that it was not merely a normal reaction, a shock, but that the state of shock I was in allowed the experience to occur. and that it was an experience of a terrible entity that had something to do with the park. He even tells me that I was in horrible danger at the time, and I was only spared because I've had many beings watching over me throughout my life. And the whole shock thing reminds me of something a lot of occultists would say about putting yourself into a state of shock in a way facilitates magic or facilitates a kind of mind state that is magically powerful in a way. So maybe there's a relation there. I also remember now that years later, when I was in a period of my life, well, years later from the event, I was in a period of my life where I was communicating with spirits, but had to use objects or sigils to call them to me at the time. And I called some of them to me when I was at Universal Studios Orlando. I was very surprised when they reacted very negatively. And they are basically saying, we want to leave now. This place is horribly evil. We want out. So I let them go. And I have to add that it, doesn't sound dissimilar from alien abduction accounts. So, yeah, I don't know. Something happened. Alright, this one's called Bedpole. At a time shortly after I had established contact with my spirit guide and then 2 other spirits, I used to experiment with how far my spirit contacts and I could push my clairsentience. At the time, I didn't even know that anyone else had ever experienced it, let alone the fact that it had a name. But one thing I would do with them is to lie on my back on my bed and ask them to pull me off of it. And then eventually my legs would be lifted up and then swayed from side to side, picking up speed. And then I would gradually be pulled off of the bed. Now, it didn't really serve any purpose other than showing me the extent to which the spirits could affect my physical body. But it was fun and fascinating. Alright, this one's called Jonathan. Now, at a time after I had established contact with spirits already, and had also been foolishly working with my own custom-made Ouija board deal, I was at the house of a friend of mine who did physical massage and also energy healing, like Reiki energy healing stuff. And as soon as I entered his house, a strong force pulled me into the room where he had his massage table set up. And the force took my arm and just held it over the massage table. And just kept it there. And then my friends came in the room to see what I was doing in there. And when they saw me just standing there with my arm held out over the massage table, I said, sorry guys, I'm not doing this, and I don't know why it's happening. I was just pulled in here. But eventually it just let go. And I mean, it wasn't forcing me. It was just a very strong, pull. And so I decided to attempt to make contact with whatever had pulled me in there, or whoever. So I got out my magic journal where I had an Ouija arrangement scrawled out on one of the pages. I put the journal down on the floor, opened it to the Ouija page, and then held my hand out over the page. I asked, I felt you pull me in here, who are you? Instantly my hand was directed to letters that spelled out the name Jonathan. After asking him more questions, I found out that he was a person who had lived and died in this house. And he told me that he pulled me to the massage table kind of basically because he wanted to indicate to my masseuse friend that he really liked the energy work that he was doing with his clients in there. So I relayed the compliment to my friend, who told me that he and his wife had experienced some mild and harmless paranormal events there. Perhaps that was Jonathan. Alright, on the next episode, I'll talk about some further experiences of mine I've called Living with a Zombie, Mystery Gifts, Pink Light, and The Trials of Jinn.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed. She went into an alternate dimension.
This article is called The Idealist View of Consciousness After Death, and it was posted to RealitySandwich.com in 2017 by Bernardo Kastrup. The following essay was originally published in the Journal of Consciousness Exploration and Research, Volume 7, Number 11, 2016. Our capacity to be conscious subjects of experience is the root of our sense of being. After all, if we weren't conscious, what could we know of ourselves? How could we even assert our own existence? Being conscious is what it means to be us. In an important sense, even the only important sense, we are first and foremost consciousness itself. The rest of our self-image arises afterwards as thoughts and images constructed in consciousness. For this reason, the question of what happens to our consciousness after bodily death has been central to humanity throughout its history. Do we cease to exist or continue on in some form or another? Many people today seek existential solace in body-self dualism, which opens up the possibility of the survival of consciousness after bodily death.
But is dualism, with the many serious problems it entails, both philosophical and empirical, the only ontology that allows for this survival? Although consciousness itself is the only directly accessible datum of reality, both dualism and the mainstream ontology of physicalism posit the existence of something ontologically distinct from consciousness, a physical world outside and independent of experience. In this context, insofar as consciousness is believed to be constituted, generated, hosted, or at least modulated by particular arrangements of matter and energy in the physical world, the dissolution of such arrangements, as entailed by bodily death, bears relevance to our survival. This is the root of humanity's preoccupation with death. However, the existence of a physical world outside and independent of consciousness is a theoretical inference arising from interpretation of sense perceptions, not an empirical fact. After all, our only access to the physical is through the screen of perception, which is itself a phenomenon of and in consciousness. Renowned Stanford physicist Andre Linde in 1998 summarized this as follows, quote, "Let us remember that our knowledge of the world begins not with matter but with perceptions. Later we find out that our perceptions obey some laws, which can be most conveniently formulated if we assume that there is some underlying reality beyond our perceptions. This model of material world obeying laws of physics is so successful that soon we forget about our starting point and say that matter is the only reality, and perceptions are only helpful for its description. This assumption is almost as natural and maybe as false as our previous assumption that space is only a mathematical tool for the description of matter. The physical world many believe to exist beyond consciousness is an abstract explanatory model. Its motivation is to make sense of three basic observations about reality. 1. If a physical brain outside experience doesn't somehow generate or at least modulate consciousness, how can there be such tight correlations between observed brain activity and reported inner experience? 2. If the world isn't fundamentally independent and outside of experience, it can only be analogous to a dream and consciousness, but in such a case, how can we all be having the same dream? 3. Finally, if the world is in consciousness, how can it unfold according to patterns and regularities independent of our volition? After all, human beings cannot change the laws of nature. Nonetheless, if these questions can be satisfactorily answered without the postulate of a physical world outside consciousness, the need for the latter can be legitimately called into question on grounds of parsimony. Moreover, while physicalism requires the existence of ontological primitives, which Strauss in 2006 called ultimate, beyond consciousness, it fails to explain consciousness itself in terms of these primitives. So if the three basic observations about reality listed above can be made sense of in terms of consciousness alone, then physicalism can be legitimately called into question on grounds of explanatory power as well. And as it turns out, there is indeed an alternative ontology that explains all three basic observations without requiring anything beyond consciousness itself. This ontology will be summarized in section 3 of this brief essay. In addition, the inferred existence of a physical world outside and independent of consciousness has statistical corollaries that can be tested with suitable experimental designs. As it turns out, empirical tests of these corollaries have been carried out since the early 80s, when Alan Aspect performed his seminal experiments. And the results do not corroborate the existence of a universe outside consciousness. These seldom talked about but solid empirical facts will be summarized in the next section. Without a physical world outside consciousness, we are left with consciousness alone as ground of reality. In this case, we must completely revise our intuitions and assumptions regarding death. After all, if consciousness is that within which birth and death unfold as phenomenal processes, then neither birth nor death can bear any relevance to the existential status of consciousness itself. What does death then mean? What can we, at a personal level, expect to experience upon bodily death? These questions will be examined in section 4 of this essay. 2. The empirical case against a world outside consciousness. A key intuitive implication of a world outside consciousness is that the properties of this world must not depend on observation. In other words, an object must have whatever properties it has, weight, size, shape, color, etc., regardless of whether or how it appears on the screen of perception. This should clearly set the physical world apart from the sphere of consciousness. After all, the properties of a purely imagined object do not exist independently, but only insofar as they are imagined. As mentioned earlier, the postulated independence of the world from observation has certain statistical corollaries, Leggett 2003, that can be directly tested. On this basis, Broblocker et al. 2007 have shown that the properties of the world, surprisingly enough, do depend on observation. To reconcile the results with physicalism or dualism would require a counterintuitive redefinition of what we call objectivity. And since contemporary culture has come to associate objectivity with reality itself, the science press felt compelled to report on the study by pronouncing, quote, "Quantum physics says goodbye to reality." Cartwright, 2007. Testing similar statistical corollaries, another experiment, Romero et al. 2010, has confirmed that the world indeed doesn't conform to what one would expect if it were outside and independent of consciousness. Other statistical corollaries, Bell 1964, have also been experimentally examined. These tests have shown that the properties of physical systems do not seem to even exist prior to being observed. Lapkowitz et al. 2011, Manning et al. 2015. Commenting on these results, physicist Anton Zeilinger is quoted as saying that, quote, "There is no sense in assuming that what we do not measure about a system has an independent reality," end quote. Ananthaswamy, 2011. Finally, Ma et al. 2013 have again shown that no naively objective view of the world can be true. Critics have deeply scrutinized the studies cited above to find possible loopholes, implausible as they may be. In an effort to address and close these potential loopholes, Dutch researchers performed an even more tightly controlled test, which again confirmed the earlier results, Henson et al. 2015. This latter effort was considered to be, quote, the toughest test yet, Morali 2015. Another intuitive implication of the notion of a world outside consciousness is that our choices can only influence the world through our bodily actions in the present. They cannot affect the past. As such, the part of our story that corresponds to the past must be unchangeable. Contrast this to the sphere of consciousness wherein we can change the whole of an imagined story at any moment. In consciousness, the entire narrative is always acquiescent to choice and amenable to revision. As it turns out, Kim et al. 2000 have shown that observation not only determines the physical properties observed at present, but also retroactively changes their history accordingly. This suggests that the past is created at every instant so as to be consistent with the present, which is reminiscent of the notion that the world is a malleable mental narrative. Already back in 2005, renowned Johns Hopkins physicist and astronomer Richard Conn Henry penned an essay for Nature 2005 wherein he claimed that, quote, "The universe is entirely mental. There have been serious theoretical attempts to preserve a material world, but they produce no new physics and serve only to preserve an illusion." The illusion he was referring to was, of course, that of a world outside consciousness. Thus, from a rigorous empirical perspective, the tenability of the notion of a world outside and independent of consciousness is at least questionable. The key reason for resisting an outright abandonment of this notion is the supposed lack of plausible alternatives. What other ontology could make sense of the three basic observations about reality discussed in Section 1? In the next section, I will attempt to answer this question. 3. A simple idealist ontology. The ontology of idealism differs from physicalism in that it takes phenomenal consciousness to be the only irreducible aspect of nature, as opposed to an epiphenomenon or emergent property of physical arrangements. It also differs from dualism in that it takes all physical elements and arrangements to exist in consciousness, solely as phenomenal properties, as opposed to outside consciousness. Historically, idealism has had many different variations labeled as subjective idealism, absolute idealism, actual idealism, etc. It is not my purpose here to elaborate on the subtle, ambiguous, and often contentious differences among these variations. Instead, I want to simply describe the basic tenets that any plausible modern formulation of idealism must entail, given our present knowledge and understanding of the world. What follows is but a brief summary of a much more extensive derivation of idealism from first principles. The defining tenet of idealism is the notion that all reality is in a universal form of consciousness, thus not bound to personal boundaries, arising as patterns of excitation of this universal consciousness. Our personal psyche forms through a process of dissociation in universal consciousness, analogous to how the psyche of a person suffering from dissociative identity disorder differentiates itself into multiple centers of experience called alters. Recent research has demonstrated the literally blinding power of dissociation. This way, there is a sense in which each living creature is an alter of universal consciousness, which explains why we aren't aware of each other's inner lives or of what happens across time and space at a universal scale. The formation of an alter in universal consciousness creates a boundary, a quote-unquote Markov blanket, between phenomenality internal to the alter and that external to it. Phenomenality external to the alter but still in its vicinity impinges on the alter's boundary. The plausibility of this kind of phenomenal impingement from across a dissociative boundary is well established. We know, for instance, that dissociated feelings can dramatically affect our thoughts and thereby behaviors, while dissociated expectations routinely mold our perceptions. The impingement of external phenomenality on an alter's boundary is what we call sense perception. The world we perceive around ourselves is thus a coded phenomenal representation, which I shall call the extrinsic appearance of equally phenomenal processes unfolding across the dissociative boundary of our alter. A living biological body is the extrinsic appearance of an alter in universal consciousness. In particular, our sense organs, including our skin, are the extrinsic appearance of our alter's boundary. As such, our brain and its electrochemical activity are part of what our inner life looks like from across its dissociative boundary. Of course, both the extrinsic appearance and the corresponding inner life are phenomenal in nature. They are both experiences. A person's brain activity correlates with the person's reported inner life because the former is but a coded representation of the latter. We all inhabit the same world because our respective alters are surrounded by the same universal field of phenomenality, like whirlpools in a single stream. And we can't change the patterns and regularities that govern the world, in other words, the laws of nature, because our volition as part of our alter is dissociated from the rest of nature. Clearly, all three basic observations about reality discussed in Section 1 can be rather simply explained by this parsimonious idealist ontology. Moreover, unlike physicalism and dualism, the ontology can also be reconciled with the empirical results discussed in Section 2. It thus offers a more promising alternative for interpreting the relationship between body and consciousness than physicalism and dualism. The question that remains to be addressed is this. If idealism is true, what can we then infer about consciousness after bodily death? This is what the next section will attempt to answer. What idealism says about consciousness after death. The idealist ontology, briefly summarized in the previous section, asserts that the physical body is the extrinsic appearance, the image, of a dissociative process in universal consciousness. In other words, a living body is what dissociation, meant simply descriptively, not as something negative or pathological, in universal consciousness looks like. Therefore, the death and ultimate dissolution of the body can only be the image of the end of the dissociation. Any other conclusion would violate the internal logic of idealism. The reasoning here is rather straightforward, but its implications profound. The hallmark of dissociation is, quote, a disruption of and or discontinuity in the normal integration of consciousness, memory, identity, and emotion. Black and Grant, 2014. Therefore, the end of dissociation can entail a reintegration of memory, identity, and emotion lost at birth. It means that bodily death, under idealism, must correlate with an expansion of our felt sense of identity, access to a broader set of memories, and enrichment of our emotional inner life. This conclusion is the exact opposite of what our mainstream physicalist ontology asserts. Moreover, there's nothing in the popular dualist alternative, mainly found in religious circles, that requires it either. So idealism is not only unique in its ability to explain reality more parsimoniously and completely than physicalism and dualism, it also offers a unique perspective on death. Circumstantially, but significantly, much of the literature regarding near-death experiences seems to corroborate this prediction of idealism. To mention only one recent example, Anita Moorjani in 2012 wrote of her felt sense of identity during her near-death experience, quote, "I certainly don't feel reduced or smaller in any way. On the contrary, I haven't ever been this huge, this powerful, or this all-encompassing. I felt greater and more intense and expansive than my physical being." It's hard to conceive of a more unambiguous confirmation of idealism's prediction than this passage, although Moorjani's entire near-death experience report echoes the prediction precisely. Moreover, as recent studies have shown, psychedelic drugs reduce brain activity. This suggests that psychedelic trances may be in some way akin to the early stages of the death process, offering glimpses into how death is experienced from a first-person perspective. And as we know, psychedelic trances do entail an unambiguous expansion of awareness, which again seems to circumstantially corroborate idealism's prediction. To make educated guesses about what happens to consciousness upon bodily death, one has to have some understanding of the relationship between body and consciousness during life. This relationship, of course, reflects an ontology. So the question of what happens after death can be transposed into the question of which ontology is most plausible for making sense of the world during life. While physicalism is our culture's academically endorsed mainstream ontology, and dualism a popular alternative in religious circles, neither ontology seems tenable in view of recent experimental results in physics. Moreover, both ontologies suffer from problems such as lack of parsimony or limited explanatory power. A third ontology, known as idealism, overcomes not only these problems but can also be reconciled with the available empirical evidence. It elegantly explains the three basic facts of reality. A, that brain activity correlates with experience. B, that we all seem to share the same world. And C, that we can't change the laws of nature at will. If idealism is correct, it implies that, instead of disappearing, conscious inner life expands, whatever new phenomenology this expansion may entail, upon bodily death. This prediction finds circumstantial but significant confirmation in reports of near-death experiences and psychedelic trances, both of which can be construed as glimpses into the early stages of the death process.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Nothing is true. Everything is beautiful. Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
Fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is changing. I'm already too far gone to know what to do.